Hello, 18th century British literature class, and welcome to my presentation of Emmeline, the Orphan of the Castle by Charlotte Smith. The edition I read was also edited by Lorraine Fletcher. I hope you enjoy. Before we begin, I have to say that I thoroughly enjoyed this novel. 5 out of 5. Would read again. I highly recommend it. It was the best thing I have read in class all year. Let's start by taking a look at our author, because Charlotte Smith put quite a bit of autobiographical information into Emmeline. Now, she began life in a place of wealth and privilege. However, it was not a perfect life. At the young age of 12, she was formally introduced to society as a young lady, and in doing so, her formal education ended, and her father did little to help her young life. As a gambler, he incurred many debts, and they got so high that he eventually had to marry an heiress named Henrietta Murriton. And unfortunately for young Charlotte, her and Henrietta did not get along. So it was eventually decided by her father and Lucy Towers that they would get her a husband. So she was married off in an arrangement to Benjamin Smith. Now, I'm not going to say that she necessarily argued against this decision, but she married very young, at just short of 16. She likely would not have known her heart well enough to make such a decision, and she would have enjoyed the benefit of no longer having to spend time with her stepmother, who she did not like. Even so, her husband really was not much better than her father. He too was a compulsive gambler, and he was adulterous, and, though it may have been beneficial, he was rather absent. They were married 22 years, and over that time had 12 children, 5 of which unfortunately died. And, as I said, he was a gambler, so he gained many debts, and it got so bad that he felt the need to embezzle his father's trust fund, and he got caught. Ended up in debtor's prison, and it was Charlotte who worked to pay off his debt, and she did so by publishing some of her poetry. And while yes, she did get him out, they lost quite a bit of wealth and property, and her husband did eventually leave to go to Normandy to avoid his creditors. To help financially support her family, Charlotte ended up doing translation work, which became profitable enough that she felt she could leave her husband. So she did, in 1787, and all of her children decided to go with her. She was a devoted writer. Over the course of her lifetime, she wrote 9 novels, 2 novellas, 4 children's books, a comedy, and 2 reflective poems. And she wrote quickly and often, almost every day in fact, though admittedly it was probably due to the financial needs, but it is still something to be impressed by. Emmeline could be considered a sentimental novel. Now, what is a sentimental novel? According to Oxford Reference, it is an emotionally extravagant novel of a kind that became popular in Europe in the late 18th century, which does in fact fit Emmeline. Partly inspired by the emotional power of Samuel Richardson's Pamela, or Virtue Rewarded, 1740, the sentimental novels of the 1760s and 1770s exhibit the close connections between virtue and sensibility. In repeatedly tearful scenes, a character's feeling for the beauties of nature and for the griefs of others is taken as a sign of a pure heart. And trust me, there are quite a few scenes that match that description. Emmeline is a strong feeling character, very emotional and prone to both tears, blushes, and fainting spells, and you'll understand why that's important in a minute. And as a sentimental novel, it has strong feelings, and this book has quite a few passionate characters. The main pursuer of Emmeline, her cousin Delamere, is a passionate, if slightly misguided man, and it is his feelings that guide most of the book. And trust me, she feels quite strongly every time he's in the room, though it is, unfortunately, not always in a positive manner. To understand how this book fits into the idea of a sentimental novel, we need to look at what sensibility even means. So let's take a look. Sensibility refers to someone who feels very deeply. Now, it is in fact different from sympathy, though they are similar. When someone is sympathetic, they see someone's situation and may feel some amount of pity. However, someone with a high amount of sensibility will put themselves quite literally into another's shoes. It requires a high amount of imagination. You see this person and you can feel their pain on a very physical level. You can see all of the torment that they went through, and in response to that feeling, you're going to want to help. And that desire to help is key to understanding sensibility, because having a high amount of sensibility made one seem very virtuous, because in response to the pain that they saw others feeling, they felt the need to be benevolent and assist in their troubles. It's why it was supposedly found more often within the upper class than the commoners. And this is the case for Emmeline. Emmeline herself may have initially been believed to be illegitimate, but she was still raised by an upper class gentleman. And then Mrs. Stafford and Lady Adelina, who were the other two main female characters, were also considered upper class. And all three of these women were prone to tears and fainting when they got emotionally overwhelmed. Having said that, let's take a look at these two women, because Adelina and Mrs. Strafford showed one of the most interesting aspects about Charlotte Smith's work, and that is her commentary on the dangers of premature marriage. During the 18th century, marriages among the gentry were still largely arranged, and unfortunately, due to the requirements of inheritance and the need for social climbing, the feelings of the partners in question were not highly considered. This led to many unhappy arrangements, and the characters in Emmeline are just a few examples of what life could be like. Remember when I said that Charlotte Smith put some autobiographical information into Emmeline? Well, Mrs. Stafford and Lady Adelina have some examples. Mrs. Stafford is married to a compulsive gambler, and he incurred many debts that did eventually get him arrested, and it was Mrs. Stafford who had to put in the work to get him released. She stayed with Mr. Stafford only out of affection for her children, and not any for her own husband. Lady Adelina's situation, however, shares similarities with Charlotte and Henrietta, because it is due to the animosity between the young Adelina and the heiress that her father remarried that she entered into the arrangement with her own husband, Mr. Trelawney. And while she did choose to marry him, she was very young, at only 16, and did not know her own heart well enough to make such a decision, and her husband was absent and adulterous. Smith uses both of these young women to show the dangers of a young marriage. She does this by contrasting their reactions to the seduction attempts of Mr. Fitzedwards. At this time, if you were in an unhappy marriage, you only had two options. which is why the differences between Lady Adelina and Mrs. Stafford are so important to this argument. One, you could do as Mrs. Stafford did, and while you did not like your partner necessarily, you found love in something else within the marriage, such as children. Or you chose the second option, as Lady Adelina did, and tried to find love outside of the marriage with another person. However, this option posed many more risks, particularly for young women, and was not always worth it. And that risk is pregnancy, because a woman who had a child outside of wedlock was considered fallen. Such women were shunned from society, and it was considered a moral failure to end up in such a situation. Thus, such characters are usually killed in these novels. However, Smith does something different. She allows Adelina to live. And though she does have a brief stint of madness, she does get a happy ending in her marriage to Fitz-Edwards. It's a point to show that women like Mrs. Stafford and Lady Adelina are not actually as different as you are led to believe. It also highlights a horrific double standard during the time period, because to keep Lady Adelina's reputation from being tarnished, her brother, Mr. Godolphin, accepts her child as his own, and nobody bats an eye at the idea of the young gentleman having an illegitimate child. Most marriages in this book are miserable affairs. The relationship between Lord and Lady Montreville is strained, and even Mr. Elkerton does not care much for the young wife that he left behind. There are happy examples. The relationship between Lord Westhaven and Augusta is born out of mutual affection, and the love between Emmeline and Mr. Godolphin is clear. Which I believe is exactly the point. Smith is not saying that marriage is bad or that you should never enter into a relationship with another person. However, it should not be a hasty decision. If there is one disappointment to Charlotte Smith's story, it is that it does not deviate much from the 18th century social systems that existed. The women of the 18th century were stuck in an area of perpetual conflict between their desires and their duties to their families. Emmeline is supposed to be a Cinderella story where a young lady found love through her own personal merits and not wealth, power, or connections. However, that was not the reality in life or in this book. Women without dowries often remained unmarried their entire lives. And Emmeline, though she did gain quite a bit of attention before she was considered wealthy, it was never attention that she desired, nor did she do anything to support such attentions. And only after she was a confirmed heiress did she get married. Even the man she did marry, who was believed to be a naval captain, had many wealthy and powerful connections in the Lord Westhaven and his other brother-in-law. And Emmeline, though she does eventually marry a man that she loves, was still very much constrained by the social expectations of the time period. She refused to enter into a relationship with Mr. Godolphin until after the engagement of which she was coerced into was ended. So really, this book itself doesn't do much to break down the expectations of marriage at all. She still had a character that fell into the requirements of a young woman for that time period, and while that says a great deal about Emmeline's morality, it does not make this book necessarily radical in that sense. Though it could have been the point to make it a realistic expectation, because she is making an argument about marriages that real people do enter into. With only 2 marriages that seem genuinely happy throughout the book, Smith does point a light on how rare it must be to enter into a relationship based off of actual love. That's not to say there was nothing radical about this book. After all, deciding to keep a fallen woman like Adelina alive goes against the norm and considering the moral expectations of novels during this time, would have been a particularly dangerous decision for publishing reasons. Though that choice might have had more to do with Smith's sympathies toward fallen women, she herself did consider entering another relationship while she was still married, because her husband's behavior unfortunately was not severe enough to constitute a legal divorce. So while they remained separate, they were still married for quite a bit of time. Despite any shortcomings, this book was interesting and had both likable and detestable characters. From these characters, we have moments of genuine love and affection uncorrupted by immoral behavior, which has been lacking in novels such as Pamela and Roxana. Though the behaviors and decisions in this book go against what we, from a modern perspective, would do, all the decisions made on at least the behalf of the women are understandable to some extent, and most of the male characters, even if you don't like their choices, you know why they are making them. It is a book where, for once, virtue really was rewarded.